And with that, we'll call our February 24th, 2022 meeting to order. And I'd first like to ask that the board approve our virtual procedures for today's meeting. A motion to adopt those procedures has been made and seconded. Is there any discussion on this pending motion? Hearing none, we'll go to the roll call. Brian Coughlin.
I approve.
Vanessa Garrett Harvey.
Hardly. I approve.
Thanks. Marcia Green Jones.
I approve.
Sherilyn Murphy.
I approve.
Roosevelt Poplar.
I approve.
Paul Reed.
I approve.
Kellen White.
I approve.
And our Vice Chair, Carol Stukes Baylor.
I approve.
All right, the motion carries unanimously. That moves us to item 2. Motion to approve our minutes from the January 27th meeting has been made and seconded. Any discussion on this motion? Hearing none, we'll move to the roll. Brian.
I approve.
Vanessa.
I approve.
Marcia.
I approve.
Sherilyn.
I approve.
Roosevelt.
I approve.
Paul.
I approve.
Kellen.
I approve.
And Carol.
I approve.
Motion carries unanimously. Item 3, a motion to approve 135 pension applications and 70 withdrawal applications has been made and seconded. Any discussion on this item? Hearing none. Brian.
I approve.
Vanessa.
I approve.
Marcia.
Approve.
Sherilyn.
I approve.
Roosevelt.
I approve.
Paul.
I approve.
Kellen.
I approve.
Carol.
I approve.
Motion carries unanimously. Section 4, 4A, a motion to approve the service-connected disability benefit for Karen Church has been made and seconded. Any discussion on this item? Hearing none. Brian.
I approve.
Vanessa.
Deny.
Marcia.
Deny.
Sherilyn.
Deny.
Roosevelt.
I approve.
Paul.
I approve.
Kellen.
I approve.
And Carol.
I approve.
The motion carries 5-3. 4B, a motion to approve the service-connected disability benefits for Kathleen Perry has been made and seconded. Any discussion on this item? Hearing none, we'll go to the roll. Brian.
I approve.
Vanessa.
I approve.
Marcia.
Approve.
Sherilyn.
Approve.
Roosevelt.
I approve.
Paul.
I approve.
Kellen.
I approve.
And Carol.
I approve.
Motion carries unanimously. Section 5. 5A, a motion to approve the service-connected death benefits for John Evans has been made and seconded. Is there any discussion on this item? Hearing none. Brian.
I approve.
Vanessa.
I approve.
Marcia.
I approve.
Sherilyn.
Approve.
Roosevelt.
I approve.
Paul.
I approve.
Kellen.
I approve.
Carol.
I approve.
Motion carries unanimously. 5B, a motion to approve the service-connected death benefits for Alexander Falcone has been made and seconded. Any discussion on this item?
Jackie, Brian here. I'd like to make a note here. I think it's very short-sighted of risk management to state what they stated in there, that because the 4 people that this gentleman worked with didn't test positive, that he did not get COVID at work, right? He doesn't have the luxury of sitting behind a computer on Zoom at home like most city employees. He actually had to go into work every day to fix police cars, fire trucks, heavy equipment. And without that, this city shuts down. Fact. There's no way around that. So anyone who's ever been to a shop would understand that people come and go dropping equipment off all day. So we don't know who was at that shop. There's no way. There's no sign-in log. We have no idea. And if you read case 5A and 5C, the words that they use are, it's presumed that they got it at work, and they approve that. But why isn't it presumed that Alexander Falcone got it at work? I would like to ask them that, right? You don't know who he came in contact with. And even if the people he worked with didn't test, doesn't mean they didn't have COVID. We all know 2 years later that most folks don't show symptoms of COVID. So I think this should pass unanimously. That's all I have to say.
Thanks, Brian. I appreciate that. Is there any other discussion on this item? Okay. There's a pending motion to approve the service-connected death benefits for Alexander Falcone that's been made and seconded. And after discussion, we'll go to the roll. Brian,
I approve.
Vanessa,
Deny.
Marcia,
Deny.
Sherilyn,
Deny.
Roosevelt,
I approve.
Paul,
I approve.
Kellen,
I approve.
and Carol.
I approve.
The motion carries 5-3. 5C, an application to approve the service-connected death benefits for Jose Novoa has been made and seconded. Is there any discussion on this item? Hearing none, we'll go to the roll. Brian,
I approve.
Vanessa,
Approve.
Sherilyn,
Approve.
Roosevelt,
I approve.
Paul,
I approve.
Kellen,
I approve.
and Carol.
I approve.
Jackie, you missed me out.
I'm sorry, and Marcia?
Approve.
Thank you. The motion carries unanimously. 6A, a motion to approve the service-connected death healthcare benefits for John McGuire has been made and seconded. Is there any discussion on this item? Hearing none, we'll go to the roll. Brian,
I approve.
Vanessa,
Deny.
Marcia,
Deny, please.
thank you. Sherilyn,
Deny.
Roosevelt,
I approve.
Paul,
I approve.
Kellen,
I approve.
and Carol.
Approve.
The motion carries 5-3. 7A, a motion to approve the application for service-connected disability benefits beyond the 1-year deadline for Gerald Dumbecki has been made and seconded. Is there any discussion on this item? Hearing none, we'll go to the roll. Brian,
I abstain.
Vanessa,
Deny.
Marcia,
Deny.
Sherilyn,
Deny.
Roosevelt,
Approve.
Paul,
I approve.
Kellen,
Deny.
and Carol.
Approve.
The motion fails 3-4 with 1 abstention. That moves us into old business, section 8A. A motion to approve the service-connected disability benefits for Michelle Epps has been made and seconded. Is there any discussion on this item? Hearing none, we'll go to the roll. Brian,
I approve.
Vanessa,
Deny.
Marcia,
Deny.
Sherilyn,
Deny.
Roosevelt,
I approve.
Paul,
I approve.
Kellen,
I approve.
and Carol.
Approve.
The motion carries 5-3. 8B, a motion to approve the service-connected disability benefits for Joseph Paul has been made and seconded. Is there any discussion on this item? Hearing none, we'll go to the roll. Brian,
I approve.
Vanessa,
Deny.
Marcia,
Deny.
Sherilyn,
Deny.
Roosevelt,
I approve.
Paul,
I approve.
Kellen,
I approve.
and Carol.
Approve.
The motion carries 5-3. Item 9, the pension disqualification regarding Robert Heenan. For board members, there will be 2 separate motions for this item. One will be regarding the permanent disqualification for pension eligibility, and the second will be regarding the treatment of contributions made. And so before I read those motions, do the board members have any questions for the law department on this item?
So Jackie, can the law department explain the treatment of contributions made?
Sure, I'll ask Ellen to walk through that, Carol.
Sure. As in past cases, the board has the authority to vote to hold the contributions for any fines or restitutions. Now, in this case, he has not been sentenced yet. It's not clear that there will be fines or restitutions. My reading of the Forfeiture Act doesn't indicate that it's necessary to wait for that to hold on to them. If there aren't any fines or restitution, then he will get his contributions back. Does
Thank
that
you.
answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ellen. So first, a motion to approve the permanent disqualification of Robert Heenan from pension eligibility has been made and seconded. Is there any discussion on this item? Okay. Hearing none, we'll go to the roll. Brian?
I'll abstain.
Vanessa? Sorry, Vanessa, you might be on mute.
I'm sorry. Approve.
Marcia?
Approve.
Sherilyn?
Approve.
Roosevelt?
I abstain.
Paul?
Approve.
Kellen?
Approve.
And Carol?
Approve.
The motion carries 6-0 with 2 abstentions. And then the second item is a motion to approve Robert Heenan's contributions be held to pay fines or restitution ordered by the court. That motion has been made and seconded. Is there any discussion on this pending item? Hearing none, we'll go to the roll. Brian?
I approve.
Vanessa?
Approve.
Marcia?
Approve.
Sherilyn?
Approve.
Roosevelt?
I approve.
Paul?
I approve.
Kellen?
I approve.
And Carol?
Approve.
The motion carries unanimously. That moves us to the executive director's report.
Because we have a busy schedule, I'll just be brief. We have this state audit exit interview on Monday, the 28th. We'll certainly provide that audit to the board when it's complete. There is just a piece of information for everyone. As you know, as you voted, Carol Stukes is the vice chair of the board. Councilperson Parker introduced a resolution last week in order to congratulate Carol for being the first female and the first woman of color elected as vice chair of the board. The resolution says very nice things, and that will be my understanding from the councilperson's office. That will be voted on today, actually between 10:30 and 11 o'clock. So, Carol, congratulations to the board. Congratulations. It's a very the board is fortunate to have you as vice chair, and it's a great honor for you also and for the board. So I wanted everyone to be aware of that. And that's all I have.
Congratulations, Carol.
Thank everybody so much. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Fran. And as always, nothing can be done without team effort. So thank y'all so much.
There are a couple of educational requests, educational seminar requests. One is for Sharon Thorpe from our staff to again attend the annual workers' compensation conference in Hershey coming up in June. Sharon has attended it for the last several years, and it's been helpful in her work on service-connected disability as an interaction with workers' compensation and offset of those benefits. So that request is in there. I don't know if anyone has a motion for that.
I'll make a motion to Sharon attend the conference.
Second.
A motion for pension staff to attend the below listed conferences has been made and seconded. Is there any discussion on this item? Hearing none, we'll go to the roll. Brian,
I approve.
Vanessa,
Approve.
Marcia,
Approve.
Sherilyn,
Approve.
Roosevelt,
Approve.
Paul,
Approve.
Kellen,
Approve.
and Carol.
Approve.
Motion carries unanimously.
And then one other education conference that's coming up is the NCPERS, the annual conference and trustee educational seminar. I'll just say that Carol is on the board of NCPERS, has been on the board of NCPERS for a number of years. NCPERS is an organization that is I'll call it an educational advocacy group assisting public pensions in understanding more about public pensions and getting information from other public pension funds about what they are doing and what best practices may be. Aside from Carol being on the board, Chris sits on the NCPERS CIO roundtable. I sit on the NCPERS CEO roundtable. It's a very good nationwide organization, and their annual conference is very helpful, especially to with a couple new trustees. It might be something that you're interested in. So that's we know that Carol. This is a request for Carol to attend, but if there's a motion for any trustee who would like to attend. I don't know if anyone would like to make that motion.
I'll make a motion for any trustee that would like to attend, be able to attend this conference this upcoming June. Also included in that motion is for Carol Stooks Baylor to be able to attend the conference on behalf of the pension board.
I'll second it.
Motion has been made and seconded regarding attendance for board and staff at the NCPERS conference. Is there any discussion on this item? Hearing none, we'll go to the roll. Brian,
I approve.
Vanessa,
Approve.
Marcia,
Approve.
Sherilyn,
Approve.
Roosevelt,
I approve.
Paul,
I approve.
Kellen,
I approve.
and Carol.
I approve.
Motion carries unanimously. Brian, is there anything else in your report?
That's it for me, Jack.
Okay, great. Is there any other new business before the board before we move into the litigation summary? Okay, and we'll go to the litigation summary.
I have, wait, one quick, for Fran. When are we gonna do are we gonna have a medical panel committee meeting?
Yes, and the medical panel is Marcia, yourself, and Kellen.
Okay.
So that will take place. The RFP is just winding up. So as soon as we get all the responses and go through them, we will schedule the medical panel. Good question, Carol. I wrote that down and forgot to mention it. Thank you.
Thanks, Carol.
Oh,
Ellen?
okay.
I couldn't find my mute button. There is an update for the litigation summary, and that is that after 4 years and a remand, the board's decision in the snow removal case was affirmed yesterday, or the day before yesterday. That's all.
Thank you. Any questions for Ellen? Okay. A motion to adjourn has been made and seconded, and hearing no objections, the motion carries unanimously, and we'll move ahead into the deferred comp plan portion of the meeting. And our first item is approval of our minutes. That's been made and seconded. Is there any discussion on this item? Hearing none. Brian?
I approve.
Francois? Or Sherilyn?
I approve.
Thank you. Vanessa?
No, wait a sec. I approve. I can't believe
Okay, law resoundingly approves. Thank you, Francois.
Uh,
Vanessa,
I approve.
Marcia,
Approve.
Roosevelt,
Approve.
Paul,
I approve.
Kellen,
I approve.
and Carol.
I approve.
Motion carries unanimously, and that brings us to our deferred comp plan update and activity report.
Nationwide, Brad and Bina.
Good morning, everyone. Bina is on vacation this week, so I will be handling our whole report out. So as of January 31st of this year, the city's 457 plan had $1,725,541,825 in total plan assets. Those are 24,533 participants in the plan. 19,131 of those are actively deferring into the city's plan. There are 117 new enrollments in the plan in the month of January. The call center for the month of January handled 3,375 calls for the month. And at the end of the month, there are 17,392 participants that have registered for an online account to manage their account online. Excuse me, 1,054 participants are contributing via a percentage contribution, an increase of 39 participants over last month, and 4,166 participants are contributing and have assets in the Roth portion of deferred comp, and that accounts for $20,214,260 in the plan. As for the activity of the local office, last month we had 92 individual one-on-one consultations. There were 125 enrollments done by the local retirement specialists getting forms completed. 15 of those consultations used the My Interactive Retirement Planner. And the team conducted 12 workshops with 123 attendees. There were 7 of those seminars were new employee orientations, various departments, DC 47, Streets Department, the Office of Sustainability conducted new employee orientations. To conclude, everybody, I believe, is aware that James Stretch, one of our retirement specialists, decided to leave Nationwide to pursue another opportunity outside. We thank him he was with the plan since the transition to Nationwide about 5 years. So we thank him for everything that he did in helping the participants in the city of Philadelphia preparing for their retirement, but he had an opportunity that was better for him and his family. So we wish him the best. The position has been posted, and we are actively recruiting to fill that position and anticipating a full group of diverse candidates to fill the position. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Brad and Jeff. Any questions from the board? Okay. I think that brings us to. Go ahead, Marcia.
I just had a question, Brad. So, based upon the fact you've had 2 people leave, I guess, recently, correct?
That's correct, Marcia. Our CFP and James,
Yes.
one of our retirement specialists.
Right. Okay. So from a sourcing and supports perspective, how do you plan in the interim period? How do you plan to support the city? Because I know people are going to be contacting you, and it's going to be a bit hectic in terms of trying to get employees scheduled, and because you guys do such a terrific job in supporting the rest of the city, I'm not quite sure how you'll manage through this transition period.
So it's a very good question, Marcia. So as far as the CFP goes, we have a home office team or retirement resource group that has 5 certified financial planners that sit on that team that are ready, willing, and able to assist with virtual meetings with participants that would want to meet with a CFP. As far as the retirement specialist, it will, for James's kind of work, if you will. That'll mainly be me. I'll be stepping in and kind of going back in time, if you will, back to the good old days, as we like to say, of being a retirement specialist and meeting with participants much more regularly than I have over the past couple of years in my new role. But it'll be myself and Candace, and I'm confident that we can. It will be hectic. You're right, but I'm confident that we can handle it.
Okay.
Brad, it's Fran. Hi. When you say your CFPs would be ready, willing, and able to meet, have they met with folks thus far? Forget being ready, willing, and able. What have they met with people thus far?
Fran, I would have to check to make sure. I believe there's been a couple referrals. I can't say for sure whether those meetings have happened or not yet, but I can send a note to check and get back to you.
Okay, thanks.
Sure.
Fran, it's Jeff, and I'm wondering in the future if it would be helpful. And Brad, I just sent you a message on this. It's interesting, Fran, that you brought this up, where we're showing the PRC activity on the board report. Until we fill that, would it be helpful for us to include PRC activity that's done virtually through that team in RRG? Would that be helpful for the board?
Yeah, and I think yes, and I think that would be responsive to the type of question that Marcia asked, and that the other board members are probably interested in. Yeah, thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Any other questions for Nationwide on this one? Okay. I think that moves us now into item 3, the fourth quarter deferred comp investment performance for 2021.
Thank you, Jackie. Good morning, everyone. So turning to page 2 on the staff's performance report for the second quarter, you'll see at the top, as of the end of 2021, total assets in the 457 plan were just under 1.8 billion, and total assets in 401A were $2,064,310. You'll see the tables on pages 2 and 3 that gives the breakout of the investments, the percentage allocated to each, and participant elections. The bottom of page 3, you'll note that, largely it was a good year for the funds. 21 of the 24 funds in the lineup ranked above median in the 3 and 5 year, those longer term periods where we tend to measure for consistency. At this point, staff, there are no actionable concerns with any of the funds. There are a few, we monitor them all, but there are a few that we are watching. One of those funds you'll note is Harbor Capital Appreciation. Recall that this is the fund, in case there's any question, this is the fund that we changed the share class. So it's a lower expense fund, but it is identical to the, the same fund that the plan has had for many years now. I just want to draw attention to the quarterly peer ranking being 81% and then 88% for the year. So recall the last reporting period, this fund was actually, top quartile or top decile in all periods. That was just 2 quarters ago. So what we're looking at is just a snapshot, a very short period performance. That longer term, performance was actually higher a few quarters ago. That's also being impacted by that, just that fourth quarter performance where, technology and communication services, were large detractors in the quarter. I want to also note that when we're looking at all of these funds, it is a comparison to, actively managed funds and index funds in this space. And so the peer rankings, include all of that. So in this quarter, the Russell 1000 Growth Index was actually top decile. So what that, how we think about that is, it was difficult for most actively managed funds to outperform the index. And so, what we'll see here is that, those top performing funds in this particular snapshot in time were likely those that were passively managed given the performance of the index fund. The other fund that we want to just take a look at or draw your attention to is the Aerial Capital Appreciation Fund, which is on page 8 of the report. This fund is our only, it's the only, sorry, I lost my page. Thanks, Bill. So the Aerial Capital Appreciation Fund is the only socially responsible fund in the plan. I want to, keep in mind that this, this fund, it's because it's a socially responsible fund, it is restricted in the holdings that it can actually invest in as compared to the index or, some of the other actively managed funds in the space. This is another case where, just last quarter, these peer rankings were, significantly better. And the Russell Midcap Index in this quarter was, again, a top quartile performer in terms of the peer rankings. So, again, this is a fund that we are monitoring. A quarter is, just a snapshot in time and, in performance. And so at this point, we're not recommending any changes. Were there any questions on the performance report? Okay. And so when we do the performance report, we always also review the Vanguard Money Market Report, which is the last page of the agenda, Bill. Thank you. And so, yep, thank you. You'll see here, as of the end of the year, December 31st, 2021, there was $125,619 in that money market fund. Recall that the board voted to issue, or a rebate was issued to qualified participants of $1 million, and that rebate happened in the fourth quarter, leaving the balance of $125,000 income into the fund through the end of the fourth quarter. So for the entire year was $217,000. Sources for that income: mutual fund rebates from other, from the mutual fund companies, and interest income, that is drawn into the account from the money market itself. There were no other expenses from the fund outside of the $1 million rebate. Were there any questions? Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Dominic. Okay. Motion to adjourn the deferred comp portion of the meeting has been made and seconded. Any discussion? Hearing none, we will move into the investment committee.
Thanks, Jackie. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to call the investment committee into session. First item is approval of the minutes from the January meeting. It's been properly seconded that those meetings be approved. Any discussion? Okay, I'll call the roll. Brian?
I approve.
Francois?
I approve, if you can hear me this time.
Loud and clear.
That is a yes.
Vanessa?
I approve.
Marcia?
Approve.
Roosevelt?
Approve.
Paul?
I approve.
Kellen?
I approve.
And Carol?
Approve.
Thank you all. That takes us to my favorite agenda item of the year, the Chiron actuarial presentation. It's a new year.
Hello, good morning, everybody.
How are you?
Good, thank you.
And does anybody else need access other than you?
No, that would just be me.
Okay.
Just give me a minute here to try and share my screen. I don't have access yet, Bill. Looks like.
And good morning, everyone. This is Brett Warren from Chiron.
Good morning.
Our
Morning.
entire
Good
Chiron
morning.
team, our whole Chiron team is here today. We have Brett Warren, Karen Zingara, Zach Allen, and myself.
Welcome
And
to all of you.
Should be the arrow next to the microphone, Anu.
yes, so it doesn't give me the option. It looks like I don't have the permissions to share. Yeah. By window. Okay, here I can do it by window. Okay. Can everybody see that?
Yep.
Yep.
Okay, so we have completed the July 1, 2021 actuarial valuation. Our presentation today is very similar to our prior year in terms of agenda. We'll review high level our results. We'll look at the historical trends for a number of key valuation results. And then we'll dig into the numbers for this year's valuation and then go into discount rate discussion and some stress testing. As the board's aware, we joined the January meeting. We have the market value asset return was a banner year, 28.42% on a market value basis. The market value of assets increased 5.78 billion to 7.34 billion. The additional investment returns are spread over 10 years for actuarial value purposes. Because there's a lot of volatility in the market asset returns from year to year, and to sort of dampen that volatility and to result in contributions that are a bit more level for actuarial funding purposes, we would smooth the gains and losses over a 10-year period. So on a smooth asset value, the return was 6.28%, and this compares to what we expected at 7.5%, which means it was lower than what we would have expected, resulting in an asset loss of 67.2 million. The actual asset value did increase from 6.24 billion to 6.63 billion. When comparing a market value and actuarial value, last year the actuarial value was 90.3% and now it's 108%. So the relationship actually reversed. We would expect this for any good asset smoothing method. We would expect that in some years, the actuarial assets are higher, and some year market assets are higher. So, in comparing last year, the actual value of assets was greater than the market value by 461 million, which means there was $461 million worth of actuarial losses that were being deferred for future recognition. That relationship now reversed, and the market value is now, there was a change of 1.17 billion, and which means there's a gain of 715 million that's being held on the books for future recognition. The investment return at 28.42% did result in enough excess earnings under the PAF calculation to result in a PAF transfer. We discussed this at the last meeting. There is an amount of 74.9 million that will go into the PAF. Looking at the other side of the equation, actual liabilities. Each year that we do evaluation, we'll take the beginning of year actual liabilities, and based on our assumptions, we would calculate the accruals, deduct the benefit payments to come up with what we would expect the liabilities to be. So when we compare where the actual liabilities ends up to the expected, the actual liability was actually lower. So there was a gain of 200.7 million. This compared to the $12 billion liability is only 1.64% of the expected liabilities. Funded ratio, great news. There was a huge improvement, 3.3% increase on the smooth asset value. So 51.9% increase to 55.2. Looking at the source of this, we started off with 51.9. There were gains both on the liability side, which increased at 1.1%. No assumption changes yet. Each year, as you're aware, the board will review and approve an assumption change on the discount rate, but to the extent that hasn't been done this year yet, there are no changes, so 0% for that. The progress made for RRP contributions coming in over and above the MMO increased at 0.8%, and then the normal progression each year of the pay down of the unfunded increased it further 1.4, resulting in a 55.2% funded ratio. This is the highest it's been since before the financial crisis, before 2008.
And then back then, when it was higher, it was at a much higher discount rate too.
Absolutely, it was at 8.75%, and we're looking at it now at 7.5%. So that's a huge improvement on the risk profile of the system. The funded ratio on market value basis, huge swing, 48% to 61.1%, 13.1% increase. And this is the first time in over 20 years that it's been this high, and over 60% since 2001. So there is a good sound funding policy in place, and obviously the assets really help with this improved projection this year. There are additional sources of revenue that come into the system. The sales tax, a portion of the sales tax revenue gets put into the pension system. Municipal members pay tier contributions, which are increased contributions based on their level of pay. There's additional contributions that come in from police and fire employees. All of these additional sources of revenue are specifically dedicated to pay down the unfunded liability at a faster rate. So typically, anytime extra revenue comes in, you would expect that the following year's MMO gets reduced because there's additional money coming in. But to the extent that this additional money is specifically to pay down the unfunded and not to reduce the city's future contributions, the mechanism that was set up to ensure that this happens is by tracking and accumulating these additional revenue sources in a separate account. So there's a separate notional account that tracks these additional sources of money and gets rolled forward each year, adding in the additional contributions that come in and increasing it with interest based on the market value of assets. So this notional account balance increased from 214 million in the prior year to 363 million in 2021. For this report and in our valuation report, we do show contribution calculations under 3 separate funding methods. The first one is the MMO. This is based on the requirements under Act 205. The next one is revenue recognition policy. This is currently the policy that is being followed by the city in making contributions each year. And it's similar to the MMO, except that this additional revenues that are tracked in this notional account get subtracted from the assets when determining the contributions under RRP. So that means that the RRP contribution end up being higher than what they would have been otherwise under MMO. Funding policy has historically been in place even before the MMO was introduced in 2004. Before the Act 205 came into play, and the city hasn't actually followed it since 2004. But it is historically been calculated, and we continue to show that. So for 2021, the valuation results for 2021 determine the expected contributions for fiscal year ending 2023. There's a 2-year lag there. Looking at the MMO, we look at the MMO both in dollar amounts and a percent of payroll. So as a percent of payroll, the MMO is actually projected to decrease from fiscal year ending 2022 to 23 from 34.17 to 33.71%. For the RRP cost, the RRP contribution is actually expected to increase as a percent of payroll from 36.65, slight increase to 36.94. However, if you look at the dollar amounts, it's actually expected to decrease. And the reason for this is that payroll decrease at a faster rate than the contributions. So dollar amounts contribution will decrease from 727 to 720 million. So for the next few slides, we're going to go over the historical trends, and Zach will take over from here.
Morning, everyone. Glad I could join you today to go over a historical review of the system. In a few slides, Anu is going to use the P-scan to go over where the plan is going in the future, but I think it's always good to take a step back and look at the progress the plan has made over the years. So we'll start here on slide 6. We see a review of plan participation going back to 2012. These the dark blue bars represent the active count. In 2021, we had a slight drop in actives, so it is about 27,000 actives, down from just under 29,000 in 2020. The yellow bars represent the retiree counts, basically anyone who is in payment status, or retirees, disabled survivors. We show 34,443 in 2021. The pink bars, the small pink bars in the middle, represent the drop counts. This is up a little bit from 2020. We're showing 1,878 in 2021, and the gray bars represent the terminated vested. So anyone who terminated with vested benefits and will be due a benefit in the future. These counts are 900 for 2021. The numbers shown at the top are the support ratio, or the ratio of non-active participants to active participants. Over the period, it generally has decreased from 1.35 to 1.23 in 2020, and then kind of jumped back up a little bit to 1.31 in 2021. This is due to the decrease in active counts, while the retiree base kind of stays similar. And the support ratio is a good measure of plan maturity, as the revenue base that supports the plan is usually proportional to the amount of actives contributing towards the plan. So we see here in 2021, each active is supporting more than one inactive participant. The black line up top shows the annual payroll amount, and that goes with the right-hand axis. You'll see it generally increases over the entire period, and then similar to the active counts dropping off and that support ratio increasing, that payroll starts to come down in 2021 just slightly, and this is due to a lot of data cleanup and the data transition for the active files with one Philly. So it's kind of where we are in terms of historical participation. If we can move along to the next slide, please. Thank you. This is the support ratio. So that number you just saw on the top of the last slide is represented by these gold diamonds, and this is where the system compares to the public plan universe. Pretty much, it's a study consisting of about 200 plans that make up the vast majority of plan assets in the public plan universe. So we'll see here at the beginning, back in 2001, the system was at the high end of that 5th to 95th percentile shown with these bars. So the plan was relatively more mature back in 2001 compared to other plans. And as time kind of progressed, other plans on average got more mature. Their support ratio increased, while the system, kind of stays level, increases, decreases, but generally against the public plan universe has gone more in towards the norm, so closer to that 50 to 75th percentile. And we see a 2021 support ratio of 1.31. So once all the data is gathered for 2021, you'd imagine they'd be somewhere in that light blue to dark blue range. Can we move on to the next slide? Thank you. On slide 8, we're showing a historical review of annual cash flows. The green bar here is contributions, city and member contributions coming into the plan. The red bar is benefits and expenses being paid out of the plan. And you'll see the blue bar is investment income. It could be positive or negative depending on market conditions and how plan assets perform. You'll see this just massive blue bar in 2021 indicating how how stellar those investment returns were for the prior year. And then we see the net cash flow indicated by the yellow bar. In the earlier years, it was negative and kind of came up to be positive starting in 2018, and the plan has had a positive net cash flow since 2018. In 2021, the benefits just slightly exceeded the contributions. So we're at about minus 0.01% net cash flow for 2021, but for all intents and purposes, very, very close to zero or positive. The net cash flow you see is without investment returns, so that blue bar is not included in the black line, and the black line below is the net cash flow as a percent of the market value of assets. That goes with the right-hand axis. So yeah, the plan had great asset performance shown by that big positive blue bar for 2021. Benefit payments have been pretty consistent since about 2015. Contributions have been ramping up since about 2018, it seems here. And that just allows the plan to have that positive net cash flow. So having a negative net cash flow means the plan has to dip into the investment income to pay out benefits and expenses, while having a positive cash flow allows the plan assets to grow a little bit more freely, and you don't have to dig into your investments to pay out on a year-by-year basis. Sorry, yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, just quick point to add, looking at this entire period, in 2015, the net cash flow as a percent of assets was negative 4.8%, which was kind of the, saying that the first 4.8% of investment returns were being used to pay benefit payments. So as the contributions have ramped up, the cash flow has, gotten better to the point where it was positive, hovering around zero. We're projecting it will continue to hover around zero. And as I said, that means that there's more opportunity for the assets to grow because they're not being depleted.
And there we go. All right. And then so just the last point here, the net cash flow as a percent of market value of assets indicated by that black line there. It kind of indicates the sensitivity of the plan to short-term investment returns. So we'll head on to slide 9 here, so we could see how that net cash flow rate looks compared to the public plan universe. Yeah, again, we show the system's net cash flow rate indicated by that gold diamond, and then the 5th to 95th percentile for each year by the different colored bars. And it shows that, yeah, it's kind of all over the place, but generally trending in the right direction as we move towards the right. There's some kind of outlier years here. So in 2004, the net cash flow rate decreased to negative 10.2% due to a PAF distribution. We, again, will have a PAF distribution in the near future, so let's look out for that. The decrease in 2010 was a result of the deferred contributions, which were subsequently repaid in 2013, which is why you see a higher positive net cash flow in that year. And the steps the big thing to look at here is that the steps taken by the city and participants in providing additional contributions to the system has reduced this cash flow risk very significantly. And as of 2021, the system, as of 2020, the system was in the top 75th to 95th percentile of net cash flow rate. And in 2021, once all the data is gathered, it'll likely be on par with how we compare to other plans in the public plan universe for 2021. So I'll move along to slide 10, please. Thank you. On this slide, we show a historical review of the funding policy, MMO, and RRP contributions. The dark blue is the city funding policy. The orange is the MMO, and then you'll see in 2018 that green bar starts popping up, and that's the RRP compared to the black line here, which is the city contributions. And there's a 2-year lag in the determination of each of these contributions. So we show contributions to date with fiscal years 22 and 2023 as estimates. So the big things to look at here, the city's actual contributions have been higher than the amounts required under the MMO and the RRP since 2016. And the city's contributions include sales tax, revenue, beginning in 2016, and also include additional contributions made by the city over the RRP. So in future years, as the city continues to pay the RRP, and as tax revenue and tiered contributions paid in excess of the MMO continue to accumulate, the gap between the MMO and the RRP will continue to grow. So you'll see in 2018 that orange and the green are very close, and then every single year that gap kind of widens. This trend is going to continue as we accumulate more in the accounts here. And let's move on to slide 11 here. We show a historical review of the city cash contributions by source. So the gray bar represents the city normal cost payment or the amount that actives are accruing over the year. The blue bar represents the amortization payment under the MMO, which is used to pay off the unfunded actuarial liability. And that's kind of where most of this is here. And then the red bar up top is the additional contributions under the RRP and sales tax. This starts to come up in 2016 and has increased just about every single year. Going back to the blue bar, this increased, the amortization payment under the MMO increased from 436 million back in 2014, which is the first year in this exhibit, to 572 million in 2023. This amortization amount had increased steadily due to changes in assumptions that had a net increase in the liabilities, as well as continued recognition of that 2008 investment loss. And the amortization amount has started to decrease starting in 2020-ish due to that investment loss being fully recognized and actual contributions starting to be higher than that MMO. And then you'll see also this black line here is the MMO as a percent of payroll, and that coincides with the right-hand axis. The total MMO as a percent of payroll was 36.9 back in 2014, and it has since decreased to 33.7 for 2023. And this is reflecting the additional contributions by the city. So if there are no questions on any of these slides, I'll pass it.
This is Brian here, real quick. Can you go back? Yeah, I kind of reference this every year, but I want to make sure, because I know there's some folks listening who may not have been part of this in the past. The gray bar is the normal cost payment, right?
Yeah.
And that you can go back much further than this chart, and that bar stays pretty flat. The normal cost is almost a fixed cost every year. It really doesn't fluctuate the way some of these other numbers do. Is that right?
Yeah, it's generally a more consistent figure as it has to do with the actives in the plan. That if there's no big swings in actives, then that normal cost is going to stay relatively flat compared to the other amounts shown on this exhibit.
Right, that's roughly 90 million. I'm just going to rough that in. So the key, and we're making great progress. The key, the bulk of the payment that the city has to make is the unfunded liability from previous years. So once we get that paid down, and we're on a pretty good pace to get that done now, last couple of years have been tremendous. I actually want to give Rob Dubois credit there. In a handful of years, when that goes away, the city should be contributing about $90 million a year for their pension payment. Is that fair?
Yeah, once the plan does achieve 100% funding and that amortization payment on the unfunded goes away, then yeah, the system would only be responsible for paying off the normal cost each year. We'll get more into projections on when that is expected to happen, where the city does reach that 100% funding. But yeah, that is the end goal, is to stop paying that blue bar. We'll pay it off and really only have to worry about that normal cost, which is a much a much more stable and obviously a much lower number. So
perfect, man. Thanks a lot.
Of course.
Right. The historical unfunded liability, the legacy liability, 80% of the unfunded on the books is primarily the 67 plans. So you're right, Brian, once the unfunded gets paid off, the contributions would be expected to drop down to the normal cost level. But to the extent that there are any future investment losses or assumptions that don't go in line with what we expect, there may be future gains and losses that would then be amortized over 20 years. But the size and nature of this unfunded, it's taken a long time, but it was a large amount to begin with.
And Anu, that's part of reducing the risk profile of the fund is the beauty of what you just said, is that as you continue to reduce the risk profile, continue to gradually reduce the assumed rate, the likelihood of falling short gets diminished more and more. So that's a plus, and that's what this board has done consistently over the last 11 plus years. So that's a good thing in reducing the risk profile. Absolutely. And it all works together.
That's right.
And we also increase the years we do the loss, right? Amortize the loss, right?
Right. Historically, that was 15 years, and it was changed with Act 44 to be 20 years.
Mm-hmm. And that's going to help it also spreading the loss across those years, right?
Right. And what also happened was that, after the financial crisis, the big investment loss, there was a reset to pay off the unfunded at the time in 2009 over a 30-year period.
Right.
And since then, the city and the members have paid in more contributions, the sales tax and these additional contributions being put aside just to pay off the unfunded. So back in 2009, we would have expected to pay off the full liability by 2039. Now we're looking at almost 9 years sooner because of all of the steps, but from the board reducing the discount rate, reducing the risk profile, the additional contributions coming in, and then the city continuing to pay not just the RRP, but in years where there's any extra amounts that they can pay, they have put that into the system.
So it's been a true joint effort, right? It's shown what cooperation among lots of actors can do to help with a pension fund.
Mm-hmm.
Indeed. Thanks for your questions. Yes, I'll pass it over to Brett to look over on some assets and liabilities. Brett?
All right. Good morning, everyone. So here we're going to pick up on the assets and the liabilities for the plan. The liabilities are shown in the gray bars, and then we're showing two sets of asset values, the market value in blue. And one thing I did want to touch on, because it kind of goes back to what we were talking about, the net cash flow. Once that net cash flow became relatively stable or relatively flat, all of those investment returns that we've seen in the last 4 or 5 years has helped contribute to increase that market value. So we can see that the market value was roughly around $4 million from 2012 to 16. That's increased about $3 billion over the last 5 years. So just over $4 billion. Now we're over $7 billion for 2021. So that's helped expedite that asset growth that we were talking about. However, on on a smooth value basis, we show the actuarial value of assets in the green bars. That's going to be a bit of a more of a smooth line, help dampen those contributions that Anu talked about, and just kind of a smoother path over the 10-year period. The number above each chart is the funded ratio. And here, once again, we can see that the funded ratio has increased to over 55% in 2021 and has made steady progress over this 10-year period. And of course, as mentioned, the highest that it's been over this period as well. And then finally, we show the investment return assumption, which kind of ties into what we were just talking about on the last slide, that as we continue to decrease that risk profile, so that investment return is the black line, that's read using the right-hand axis, up around 7.95% at the beginning of this 10-year period, down to about 7.5% at the end of the period. So even though we're decreasing that investment return, which increases the liabilities and decreases the funded ratio, we could see that there's been improvement on the funded ratio over this 10-year period. So that, of course, contributes to better success in future years when we're measuring against the updated investment returns.
I guess, Brett, to put that a different way, if we had been at 7.5% back in 2012, that 48.1 would be much lower and the progress would look even better.
Correct, at 7.95%. I don't have it offhand, but the funded ratio would be higher on that basis, yes.
Yeah, this 48% was likely would have been about 44% at the 7.5.
Thanks.
Yep. So moving to slide 13, this just shows you the pattern and volatility of our asset returns. This goes back to 1995, so this is about a 25-year history that we're looking at. Here, the asset return assumption in red, that was up at 9% back 25 years ago, so it's declined about 1.5% or 150 basis points over the 25-year period. We're showing the market value returns. Again, they're going to be a bit volatile. One thing you can notice here, of course, in 2021, that return over 28% was the highest return that we've seen for the system over the 25-year period. However, of course, we do want to smooth out those gains and losses, which we do on an actuarial basis. So when we look at the green line, that's going to be a bit more condensed. We can see that that's going to be closer to the return assumption. And, that helps, again, smooth out the contributions going forward. And that's kind of the purpose for that number. And then the number at the bottom, just to mention the geometric return. So again, the time period is very important in terms of how that's going to be measured. So we include the 28% return over this period. That jumps up to showing a 7.44 average return over 25 years compared to 6.71 last year. So just adding that 1 year of significant returns does have a pretty significant impact on that average return over the period. Jumping to slide 14, this is a chart that I like. This is something we've kind of been referencing a couple of times already, the unfunded liability. This actually shows you the sources of those unfunded liabilities and how that change in the unfunded liability has changed from year to year over the 10-year period. So here again, we show various sources, assets, liabilities, pay down of the unfunded, as well as additional contributions coming in and assumption changes. And then the net change, or the black line, that's going to be our change in the unfunded each year. So numbers above the 0 mark, that's going to be what's increasing the unfunded liability each year. And then numbers below the 0 mark are going to be decreasing the unfunded liability each year. So the big takeaway from this chart is we could see through 2017, the unfunded liabilities were increasing every year. However, in the last 4 years, the unfunded liabilities have been decreasing every year. And here we can actually see the numbers behind the message we were talking about in terms of the higher contributions that have been used to pay down the unfunded liability. That's in the red bars. We can see in the last 4 years, that's been very significant in paying down that amount. The additional RRP contributions in green, that's also been helped to pay down the unfunded liability. The fund is no longer recognizing those financial crisis returns, the returns from the financial crisis, which were a 10-year period, kind of dragged on the fund through 2018, as well as the returns we've seen in recent years to help pay down the unfunded. And then we do have a liability gain in 2021 in the gray bar, which also is decreasing the unfunded liability. So I think it's a good message in terms of kind of what's been going on in the last 10 years and how the system has progressed in paying down that unfunded liability. Moving to slide 15. This is a chart that specifically just focuses on the liability changes and how they affect the funded ratio. So when we say liability changes, we're talking about experience. So that's our demographic experience from year to year. That's shown in the blue bars. And then our assumption changes, which is primarily the discount rate changes, as well as changes from experience studies. Finally, there are plan changes, however, been very minimal over this time period, shown in the pinkish color. And kind of the number above each chart, that's essentially how the funded ratio was affected by these changes. So, for example, just to give an example, in 2012, the changes related to liability and assumption changes that decreased the funded ratio by 0.72%. So each year you can add those numbers up and kind of get an idea of how the funded ratio has been affected by liability and experience changes. But I think the big takeaway here is the changes as they result to liability are primarily driven by those discount rate changes, which again, bringing down the discount rate each year increases the liabilities, as well as those experience study changes, which have generally been moving towards more conservative assumptions, and those kind of help build in against future losses going forward. So that's kind of what we're seeing here in terms of how the funded ratio moves from a liability perspective. If there's no, that was the last slide on historical. We're going to move into the 2021 valuation results. So this first slide just takes a look at our summary of participation for the plan. As touched on before, actives were down about 6.5% to roughly just over 27,000 for 2021. That's in the first row that we're looking at. And that's primarily due to we had less new hires come in this year. Generally, in prior years, we've had a higher influx of new hires. This year, hiring was a little bit lower, so that resulted in less actives. In addition, we had increased numbers in terms of retirement, drops, and terminations. You know, a lot of that could be related to the pandemic, as well as members may have deferred either retirement or moving into drop status into this year. So, you know, we saw less retirements last year. We're seeing more of it this year. And that's kind of played into, you know, where we saw the active counts this year. However, members in payment, when we look at retirees, survivors, disabled, those have been relatively stable in the last year, slightly down by between 0% and 1%. We did see slightly more deaths in the last year, and that, you know, and that might also be related to the pandemic. Not necessarily something we would be projecting forward, but that would be a reason for the slightly decreased counts from last year. Terminated vested is down about 3%, again, as more members move into payment. And then drop members were up about 14.4% to almost 1,900 for 2021. We tend to see this number fluctuate from year to year, depending on the number of drop enrollees. This year, we saw a large uptake in drop enrollees. About 700 moved into drop for 2021. The year before, the count was a lot lower, so we saw a decrease. So we'll kind of see fluctuations in the drop members from year to year. So in aggregate, the population for the system dropped about 2.7%, still over 64,000 total members for 2021. Looking at the salary growth, the salary for the entire active population was about 1.92 billion last year in 2021, dropped to just under 1.9 billion 1.88 billion for 2021, which is about a 1.8% drop. That would be as expected, as we saw a 6.5% drop in the active total group. So as an aggregate salary, we would expect that to drop as well. However, on the average annual salary, that's increased by about 5%, which is now roughly about $69,819 per participant. That would be expected to grow each year as members continue to receive salary increases. So we would project the average salary per participant to grow each year. And then finally, when we look at inactive members, the benefits that are in pay status that are getting paid out by the system, that's increased by about 2%. We're now over we're about 805 billion this year, increased from 789 billion last year. And then on an average monthly benefit, similar result, about a 2.3% increase from last year. And again, this is something we would also continue to expect to see as members who move into payment generally receive higher benefits as salaries continue to increase. And then members who drop off the file tend to drop off with lower benefits, and as those members who are older would have had lower salaries when they were in commenced their prior benefits. So moving on to slide 17. So next two slides, we're going to look at the experience gain loss for the plan. As noted before, this is the demographic experience. We saw a net liability gain of 200.7 million for the year. This generally looks at changes in the population as they result to our assumptions each year. So we're talking about retirement, termination, mortality, and disabled members, how that compares to our actual experience versus what actually happened in the system each year. The first point I'm going to touch on, though, this is a one-time reduction in the liabilities. We had a credit service adjustment for breaks in service. So this resulted as a bit of a data cleanup, something we've been trying to work with the city with for a number of years. So before this year, when we received active data, the system wasn't able to account for breaks in service when we received service for members. However, we moved to the new One Philly system this year. There's been a number of cleanup in terms of receiving better data, and what we think hopefully will be, something going to be more reliable going forward. And one thing that was fixed was the service issue. So now we were receiving credited service that contains these breaks in service. So now they're going to have slightly less service than what they had before, which is more accurate to what we would expect going forward. And that was a one-time gain of about 164 million of that entire gain for this year. When we look at ongoing changes that we would, analyze from year to year, salaries were lower than expected. So we're going to continue to see salaries fluctuate from year to year. That was a gain of 77 million. Decrements different than expected. That was a loss of 57 million, and that primarily has to do with, again, that increased retirement, members moving into drop, kind of members moving into that retirement status. And that's kind of that delay that we saw last year when we saw less retirements. There was a mortality experience gain on retirees of about 7.8 million, and that was due to, again, higher death rates than expected. Again, also could be related to the pandemic in the last year. Not something we would expect going forward, and not something that we would necessarily affect our long-term assumptions. But of course, we're doing an experience study this year, and we'll kind of be analyzing over the last 5-year period on that. There was some gains on benefit payments in the PAF load, which is about 8.2 million. So slightly lower benefit payments than expected result in a slight gain. And then the PF load on the liabilities, that accrues interest from year to year. So we do see a slight gain there as well. And then the other changes is just a small offset of everything, which is about 0.3 million. So overall, the liability experience was very good for this year. If we exclude the one-time reduction of the 164 million, The total net gain was only about 36 million. So that's a really small number in terms of the total liabilities, which is now over $12 billion. So just put that perspective, it's about 0.3% of the liabilities. So, you know, we're seeing the experience very much well aligned with our expectations in the past year. And of course, again, we'll be looking at this when we work on the experience study as well. Moving on to slide 18.
Brett, just give some indication that there won't be any kind of big movements in the experience study too. Should it follow this?
In recent years, we haven't seen much gain loss in terms of liability. So, you know, we're early in looking at it. I wouldn't expect any major changes. I know one thing that generally increases is mortality as members continue to be projected to live longer. Of course, this past year did not show that, but in recent years we continue to see that. In terms of the other assumptions, though, we haven't seen much deviation, so we wouldn't necessarily expect that to see major changes. Anu, if you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, I just flipped here back to page 14. Since our last experience study, which was 2018, you'll see that we don't have much of a gray bar here, showing that the changes we made in 2018, our experience is very similar to what we had expected. So just looking at that, this is a one-time thing we just talked about, but the fact that we've had really small liability gains and losses indicates that we shouldn't expect any drastic changes. And anything related to COVID, we would factor in because that shouldn't affect long-term assumptions. If we were seeing big gray bars, then we would expect that some adjustment will be needed as we approach the experience study.
Got it. Thank you.
So now that we've gone through the liabilities, we're going to take a quick look on the financial experience, which I'll go through rather quickly because I know we've talked about this a couple times already. Market value returned over 28% for the year. On an actuarial smooth basis, that was about 6.28%. So we did recognize a small loss on an actuarial basis for assets this year. However, again, we are deferring those a lot of that gains for future years to help offset future losses. We put together this chart generally every year for historical asset returns, just more of kind of a reference to show you how this 3 to 20 year average has been. Of course, though, the change in these returns can be very significant based on the period studied. Just to give you an idea, when we're looking at the 20-year average number on a market value basis, that was 6.51%. So that's the last number on the last number in the market value column. And if you compare that to the footer, the 20-year average was 4.86% last year. So that 28% return increased that 20-year average by more than 1.5%. Again, current return ratio at 7.5%. We'll get deeper into that when we look at the discount rate discussion. And then finally, the drop account balances represent about 2.13% of the entire market value of assets compared to 2.69% last year. And just to kind of touch on that, we did talk about drop members increased 14%. So, maybe you would think this would increase, but part of that is the drop balances for the new members. That there's a huge influx of new members, so their drop balances are going to be relatively low. And then also the market value has increased very significantly from last year. So now we're comparing those drop balances to a much larger asset base. So the percent of the total is therefore going to drop from last year to this year. So it's roughly about 2% of that entire market value. Yep, go ahead.
And we look at this drop balance as a percent of market value because it sort of represents 2% of assets could be withdrawn if drop members decide to, all leave and take their lump sum. So it's sort of a risk indicator, and we look at it just to track it from year to year, how it compares to the total market assets.
Right. But of course, as the market value continues to increase, it becomes less of a risk factor because that becomes a smaller portion of the entire asset size. So that kind of takes us through the liabilities and asset experience. I'm going to hand it over to Karen, and then she's going to go through the remainder of the results for 2021.
Thank you, Brett. Good morning, everyone. So I'm going to go through the details of these numbers that have already been presented so far. I'm not going to go through every number. I'm going to give you the highlights here, so it's not going to be too boring. On this page here, slide 19, we're showing how we calculate the actuarial value of assets. This is where we smooth the asset gains and losses over a 10-year period. You can see here there's a 10-year history of the asset gains and losses back to 2012, thanks Anu. And you can see that there's 5 years where the numbers are positive. We had gains, especially this last year with 1.2 billion, and 5 years where they're negative. And the market value of assets goes up and down, and that's why we recognize 10% a year and defer the remaining percentage for the future, which is in that percentage deferral column. And then the amount deferred is simply the percentage deferred times the gain or loss, add it all up. We're at 715 million. That's the future gains that we're going to be recognizing coming forward. And so then we take the preliminary actuarial value of assets, which is the market value of assets minus that deferred amount. We're coming up with 6.7 billion. And we make sure we're in the quarter, we are, and then we take out the additional PAF transfer amount, the 75 million. And that brings us to our final actuarial value of assets of 6.6 billion. It is roughly a return of 6.3%, so it's a little bit less than what we were expected in terms of our expected return on assets of 7.5%. Next slide, please. Here we're going through the actuarial value of assets for the revenue recognition policy. As has been discussed already, this revenue recognition policy takes out the additional assets that's associated with the sales tax in the past and the additional member contributions. So what we have here is this notional account that's tracked every year, and we have last year, the notional account was 2.4 million. You can see this in the top line here, item 1 under the right-hand column. And then we add in the sales tax and we add in the additional member contributions. We increase it based upon the return on assets this past year, 28%. And that brings our notional account up to 363 million. So for the RRP calculation, we take the actuarial value of assets and just subtract out that 363 million. Next slide here. This slide we've already reviewed with the board at the January meeting. This is the development of the pension adjustment fund. This goes through the calculation of how the $75 million was determined for the transfer amount this year. I don't know if we need to go through this in detail since we just approved. So maybe we just go on to the next slide here. Key valuation results. So now we're looking at the liabilities versus the assets. We're looking at this last year and this year. And that first line item is the present value of all future benefits. So what is that? That is the actuarial liability plus the assumed additional accruals that the actives are assumed to earn in the future. So it's the 12 billion plus the additional accruals expected. And so you can see this went down ever so slightly from 13,760 million last year to 13,700 million this year, really because of the change in the population. And then we compare this present value future benefits to the current market value of assets plus future resources. Remember, we're looking at future liability, so we have to look at future resources when we're looking at a comparison. So we look at the present value of the future employee and city's contributions, that's the normal cost. The market value of assets, that's 7.3 billion. And then we look at that present value of the future amortization payments, the 5.4 billion. And so in total, we add that up and we compare it to the present value of future benefits, and 715 million surplus. You might go, oh, great, we got a surplus. Well, really, what is that? That's really just the difference between the market value of assets, that 7.3 million that we looked at before, and the actuarial value of assets, that 6.6 billion. So that 715 million is really just a difference between those two asset values. And you can see the asset value, actuarial value of assets below of 6.6 billion compared to the 12 billion in actuarial liability. And there's our unfunded liability, 5.4 billion. That matches up above the present value of the future amortized amounts. That unfunded liability, think of it as a mortgage that needs to be paid off in the future. That's the amortization of the mortgage payment up above. So we've talked about this already. The funded ratio is 55%. And on a market value of assets, that funded ratio has increased from 48% to 61%. Any questions on all these numbers? Okay, going on. Now let's look at the gain and loss a little bit more, not just looking at the liabilities, but looking at the actuarial value of assets. So what we've done here is we've rolled forward our values as of July 1, 2020 to, that's line item 1, to what we expected. That's line item 5 for the liabilities, 12.2 billion and 6.7 billion. And we're saying we expected the unfunded to be 5.5 billion, but in fact, we had some gains on the liabilities. That's what Brett went through, the $200.7 million gain. And on the actuarial value of assets, remember that return was only 6.3%. So we actually had a little bit of a loss there, a $67 million loss here. But in aggregate, $133.5 million gain. So our present value, our final unfunded liability actually decreased more than expected. So now it's 5.4 billion. Next slide. That unfunded liability, that's what's used to determine the amortization payment for each of the different ways that we calculate the contributions. There's 3 methods we do this. Okay, the first way here is the MMO contribution rate. So what's this made of? This is made up of the cost of the accruals during the year, the normal cost with the expenses. We look at that in total, 200 million. And it went down dollars from last year where it was 203 million to really 199 million. Then we take out the employee contributions, not just those regular employee contributions, but also the additional employee contributions. And so the city's normal cost would be 84 million this year compared to 86 million last year. You can see normal cost as a percentage of pay really didn't change. But the payroll did come down, and that caused the normal cost to go down. Then what's the MMO made of? It's just not the normal cost. It's also that amortization of the unfunded, that 5.4 billion. This year that did come down from 592 million to 573 million, so 657 million MMO payment this year. But going to the next slide, we have the RRP contribution. Remember, this isn't using the actuarial value of assets. This is using the actuarial value of assets minus that RRP notional account. And the other piece here is we don't take into account the additional employee contributions. So you can see that line item is 0 now. That increases the city's normal cost up to 113 million. And then again, because we're not taking into account that notional account balance, it increases the amortization payment as well. This is giving you the details behind those charts that Zach was showing us earlier with the orange bar, the blue bar, and the green. And lastly, we have the city's funding policy. Okay, And again, we're using the amortization payment here, taking into account the old amortization funding policy without any fresh start. And so you're having an increase in that amortized amount. And again, the city's funding policy is coming in a little bit higher at 750 million. So those are the details behind the numbers, sort of in a nutshell. Any questions on this? Okay, great. Anu, I'm giving it over to you.
Thank you, Karen.
Yeah.
So we're now going to talk about the discount rate. This is a discussion. The board reviews this every year. Here we're showing you the data that's compiled in a survey by NASRA, the National Association of State Retirement Administrators. And what they do, they have collected the investment return assumptions historically back from 2001 to 2022 across about 130 plus systems. So what this is showing that over time, the trend across the country has been, the trend has been that the discount rate is being lowered with the low interest rate environment. This has been a trend that all systems have been following. Back in 2001, the median was 8%. We're now looking at a median of 7%. Philadelphia currently, where our system is at 7.5. And we've seen that the median has been decreasing each year, and the number of plans that was assuming at least like 7.5 and lower has been increasing. This year, the survey was actually broken down to show, between 6.5 and 7%, and with some systems here in the last 5 years or so, starting to even decrease it further below 6.5%. So whereas the trend has been to lower the discount rate, some systems that may make sense, for other systems, those large increases, may or may not be appropriate. But for us, taking a large decrease in 1 year may result in a financial shock to the system because of increased contributions. The approach that the board has taken in reviewing every year, what the impact would be of small incremental changes. So there's a flight path to de-risk versus making, drastic changes that could cause financial shock. This is a good and sound method. Every year the board reviews and does reduce the discount rate to the extent that the city can also continue to make those higher contributions. And, specifically for our system compared to others, the MMO requires or mandates a contribution. So at least there is a minimum required, and the RRP being contributed is over and above that minimum required.
I'm glad you brought that point out concerning the contributions, because you can't just look at the median assumed rate of return alone, as you pointed out, because when you look back to the Pew study, our city's contributions are in the 95th percentile compared to other public pension funds. So, where someone might have a 7.0 or somewhere in that neighborhood, the assumed rate of return, they either have the ability to take a funding holiday because they're not subject to a state law, which is an MMO, or they fund a minimum amount, certainly not in the 95th percentile, as the city has been doing. So there is an offset to that assumed rate of return. The gradual approach, I think, has worked well, and as our projections and actual results have shown. So I'm glad you brought up those 2 points in tandem, because they have to be considered in tandem. One cannot be looked at alone. It does not work for our fund.
Right, that's right, because, a big change, a decrease in discount rate, increases in contributions. And if you can't make those contributions, or you take, like, as you said, pay a portion of the contributions, take, contribution holidays, it defeats the purpose. So in looking at how can the system reduce potential exposure to potential future asset losses, periodically reviewing and updating the asset allocation, with the intention of lowering the system's exposure to investment risk. This is something the board does and reviews periodically, and then slowly decreasing the discount rate assumption so that there's a higher probability you're going to attain that expected return. Again, this is something that the board does every year. So in line with that, we are showing the financial implications of a 5 basis point decrease. Anytime the investment return assumption is decreased, the liability would increase, which means that the contribution will increase. So showing the increase in RRP here, it would go for 7/1/2021, which is the fiscal year ending 23 contribution, it would go up from just under 720 million to just under 727, an increase of 6.1 million. The unfunded liability would also go up because the actual liability goes up, and that would go up by 56.5 million. And the funded ratio would go down by 0.3%. These increases, when looking at it in small amounts, they are considered linear. So if you're looking at a 10 basis point decrease in discount rate, you could almost look at these values and double them to come up with what the impact would be. So that shows you just the impact of 5 basis points for the 1-year contribution. On the next page here, we show projected contributions under RRP for a number of different scenarios for budgeting purposes. So this shows a 5-year projection. Baseline shows the current 7.5%. Assuming all of our assumptions are met, what would the RRP be over the next 5 years? And what would the funded ratio look like? You can see there's good progression here of increasing funded ratio. Decreasing, we show changing it down 5 basis points to 7.45. The impact would be an increased amount of between 6 and 7 million over the next 5 years, with the funded ratio when compared to the baseline under the 7.5 would be 0.3% lower. We also show this for 10 basis points, 15 basis points, and 30 basis points, just as, for budgeting purposes and comparisons for what the RP contributions may look like under the different discount rate scenarios. So then we move on to our projections. Most of you are familiar with this. Is a projection of our P-scan modeling tool that we project what the 25-year projections, what the assets and liabilities would look like. So what we're showing here, the top graph here, the gray bars are the liabilities, and we expect the liabilities to increase over time. The blue and green lines here are the assets. You can see here, initially, we're seeing there is a difference there. The market value of assets are higher, as we've just discussed, for 2021. And as those gains get smoothed over 10 years, they start to converge, and then they overlap. Up top here, we show the funded ratio. So we're currently at 55.2%, projected to be projected to go up to 118.7%. This is based on the city paying the MMO. And we're expecting that in each and every year going forward, we would earn the 7.5% every year. Based on this baseline projection, if the city would contribute on the MMO, the 2 targets that the board has reviewed in terms of tracking their progress and improvement in funding from year to year has been, what year does the system reach 80% funded? And then when does it reach 100% funded? So here, based on MMO, projected to reach 80% in 2029, 5 years later for 100%. The bars down here show you the contributions that are needed to be that support that increase in funding. The red bars are the MMO, expected MMO amounts. We do show what the sales tax and the member contributions are going to be as well over that period. And then the lines show you the alternate funding policies, where the blue line is the revenue recognition policy and the green line is the funding policy. So we show the projections under all 3 funding methods. If based on the funding policies, if the contributions were made based on the funding policy, you would see that the funded ratio would go up from 55 to 99.2%. So it doesn't really, it gets to 100, close to 100%, and then it starts to decrease because of the way the contributions move. RRP, this is the current policy that the city is paying on. And based on this, at the 7.5% assumption, the funded ratio is expected to increase 55.2 to 134. There's good sound progression here. The projections have seen a nice improvement compared to last year, given this nice asset returns in the past year. So now the 80% funded target is 2028. Comparing that to last year was 2030, so 2 years sooner. And the 100% has come up 3 years in 2021 compared to 2034 last year. Looking at the contributions that are needed to reach that, the blue line showing the RRP contribution continue to be fairly level, may decrease, and then you see this large decrease here, going back to Brian's point. When you reach 100% funded up top, there is no unfunded liability to pay anymore, which means then in the following year, the contributions in the system would be based on the annual accrual benefits. That's just what we call the normal cost. So the annual accrual of benefits for active members. Now, members make their own contributions. A portion of those annual accruals are paid. The yellow portion is the members' portion. The red would be then the city's portion of that normal cost that the city would pay. We know that experience is going to be different, 7.5%, whereas might be achieved over a long period of time, but there's going to be ups and downs in the market. So, which is why we've always looked our model to do stress testing. The board, since we've worked with the board with Chiron, the board has every year reviewed what the contributions and the projections may look like under various scenarios. In September last year, there was a bill that was passed that codified the board's practice in the annual review of stress testing. Our valuation report, even prior to this, did provide multiple scenarios, hypothetical scenarios for investment rates and the different funding policy approaches, showing both negative and positive returns, as well as stochastic projections, which would more than satisfy the requirements under the bill. And this is just letting the board know that, it's a new change with the bill that was passed in September 21. So as I mentioned, baseline 7.5% is not going to, we know that it's not going to be 7.5% every year, even though on average over the projection period, it may still be 7.5. So here we're showing if the returns were varying, but over this projection period, the returns on average were 7.5. What does that look like? Now, the funded ratio, you can see here, there's fluctuation, gains and losses. Now the blue and green lines are in years where we have losses, they're being amortized over 10 years. Gains and losses are both causing this deviation between the market and actual assets. Looking at the funded ratio up top, 55%, when is projected now to 119.4% here, and this compares to the baseline scenario at 134. So we know that, even though with the fluctuation, that could cause both volatility in the contributions and the funded ratio projections. We'll review the two stress test scenarios that we have in this booklet before we jump to the live model. Here we're showing a 1-year negative shock. So this is showing if fiscal year ending 2022, we ended up with a negative 10.4% return.
I'm sorry, just go back. Can you go back to the slide before for a second?
Sure.
Can you talk a little about what's happening in 2033 on the contribution side? So it looks like the MMO comes back kind of in a big
right
way.
Because there's this 1 year, there's a dip here where it goes below funded ratio, so there's an amortization payment that's due. There is, once the system becomes fully funded, there is, or even above 75% under Act 205, there are different rules which haven't been, we haven't coded those fully. But that can, there are different funding rules once it gets to that high levels of funding.
But is that essentially paying off the 2030 loss? Is that what that's showing?
Yes, it's actually paying it off in the 1 year. Mm-hmm.
So I think one other thing to note is this does assume that the RRP continues at the same policy throughout the 25-year policy. So in that 1 year, it does bounce back to that RRP policy where you're not including those, those additional assets, which does look like it's a huge jump. So it's very possible the policy changes between now and the next 15 or 20 years. But just for purposes of the projections, that policy is in place.
Okay, thanks.
Yep.
So looking at the 1 year shock scenario, negative 10.4% in the first year, that this would mean that the 80% funded is now a year later and 2 years later for the 100% funded. So it just kind of shows, even 1 year of plus or minus returns can really change the projections. Looking now at a 1 year positive shock, which, is showing 14.4% in year one, and then the assumed rate for the remainder. And now we're reaching 80% funded a year sooner, and then 2031 still remains for 100% funded, the same as under the baseline scenario. So I can switch to our live model now.
Anu, we're still waiting for the year when you say, and you know what, we're going to give you our live model and you can play around with it all year long.
We can actually give you an online version that could have plenty of capability to play around with the discount rate. So that is something we could do if you're interested.
Yeah, that would be great.
Okay, we could talk about that. We could give you some details on that.
Thank you.
Okay, so this is now the baseline scenario under RRP. And as I mentioned, funded ratio is improving nicely up to 134%. And the revenue recognition policy here fairly, staying stable up until reaching 100% funded, and then it drops. And we can show you different scenarios. We have the ability to program if you want to see historical returns based on, historical asset with a 40-60 investment allocation. We can show you historical returns if you'd like to see, or any other scenarios for discount rate or anything else.
Yeah. I think you've done before, you kind of plugged in specific years, and it shows the history of what returns look like after that. Am I remembering?
Yeah,
that?
right.
So if you put in like the year of the fiscal crisis, it would show, for example.
So here I plug 2000, and I can change this to whatever year you want. And so what this does is, historical returns back to 2000. If we said 2021 was the year 2000, what would the projection then look like? And you'll see here, then the financial crisis is hitting 10 years from now. And we can change this. I can move it up or down, whatever what you'd like to see. But what it does, you can see again the fluctuation in the market assets, and then you see now the funded ratio, 100% is not reached till 2037. The RP contributions continue to be.
Am I seeing that right? It's like 3 or 4 years of losses before you have a positive. Is that? You seeing that?
Yeah, so it's showing about 3 years of losses before positive.
Okay.
And
so
then it's also, factoring in this huge, 20% decrease from the financial crisis.
And are we still showing, and I can't see, so are we still showing slight progress every year on our funding percent, even with these losses, just not as big? Is that what, or are there some dips?
Yes, no, we are showing, so there's still progress on the funding ratio, even with the losses, and the net cash flow being zero. That's what helps to be more resilient in, these down markets, because you're not draining the assets to pay for benefit payments. But, these numbers, it's going 55.2, 55, 58.8, 61.5. So it is increasing. It dips a little bit with this large loss, and then it starts to increase again. So
And
it's
part of the
still showing
reason
improvement.
why is because we don't recognize those losses all in one year. That's the 10-year smoothing for the actuarial value of assets coming into play too.
Right. And so if for 2021, we now have that 715 million. That's the gain that's being recognized in the future years. And that helps, it helps dampen the effect of possible losses in the immediate, in that 10-year period.
Right. Okay. So the positive cash flow plus the 715 gives us a little cushion against what might happen over the next few years. Is that fair?
Yes.
Okay. What, you put in a year that would then have some good years of return after it, just so we could feel a little better?
So let's see. If we started in this is, showing a big, maybe we go one more year since we've just come out of a big year, but still showing some positive returns for about 4 years. But the, negative 20 still takes the system. And here we're comparing, if the RRP, the impact on the RRP over the 5-year period due to these changes. The first 2 years, you don't see the change because 2022 is based on the 2020 results. Right. So the first impact you'll see really for something that would affect the system fiscal year ending 2022 would be starting the 2024 contribution.
Right. And sorry, when you were at 2000, what was the impact on the RRP?
Oh yeah, it was about 93 million higher
over 5 years.
5 years. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
With the
Thank you. Anybody have any other questions or want to see other scenarios?
We go back here, and if we changed, we could look at discount rate changes now. We'll start with the 7.45, which is 5 basis point decrease. And you'll see that the funded ratio drops immediately because we're assuming this rate is going to be for July 1, 2021. And the RRP contribution over this period increases between 6 and 7 million for a total of 33.8 million for 5 years.
Can we do 5 more? Do it 7.4 looks like.
Mm-hmm.
And as you said, it's linear, right? So it's basically
right. So it's about 12 to 14 million with a total of 68.3 million.
And we're still right around 55% funded.
Right, just under. And the 80% and 100% funded numbers don't really change. We're still 2028 and 2031 because with the decrease in discount rate, the contributions are going up to make up for it.
Okay. Any other questions about that? Okay.
And what did she say we was funded at? 55 or 56?
We're at 55.2%, and that would go down to 54.7 with the 10 basis points decrease to 7.4%.
Any other questions?
Or any other scenarios anybody wants to see? Okay. So that's all we had for the valuation. We will be back at the next meeting in March because we are working on the experience study. We have a number of items that we're completing for the systems that will be completed by the end of March. We'll produce our full valuation report. We'll be back here with experience study results and to discuss the analysis. And this year there are the Actual 5 filings that are due that will also be completed by the end of March.
And the thing you need from us then is to know what we want to do on the discount rate, right?
And that's correct, before we can finalize any of that.
Okay. Thank you. Any other questions from members of the board? Okay, thank you so much for your presentation.
So would the board be looking to discuss the discount rate assumption today, or should we expect to hear?
We're going to discuss that right now.
Okay.
So at this point, would the board like to discuss the discount rate now? And if we would, are there any proposal on what to do?
Rob, this is Brian. I'm comfortable with the 10 basis point drop. I'm going to assume you are too, so I'll make the motion to drop to a 7.4 assumed rate of return.
And Rob, I second that motion.
The motion's been moved and properly seconded. Any discussion? If not, I will call the roll. Brian?
I approve.
Francois?
I approve.
You, Vanessa?
I approve.
Marcia?
Approve.
Roosevelt? I approve.
Paul?
I approve.
Kellen?
I approve.
Cal?
I approve.
Thank you. It's been unanimously approved that the discount rate will be reduced to 7.4%. Thank you all very much. And thank you to Chiron for the presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That takes us to agenda item 3, the MWDDE and local brokerage report.
Good morning. Thanks, Rob. Looking at the second page of the report, very positive news on the equity front. 52% of total equity trades in calendar year 2021 were directed to qualifying brokers. Overwhelming majority of managers were at or above their target. And for example, Investors Group, who was in the low to mid 20s, just as an example, the last 2 or 3 years, they've been at or above 35%. So that appears to be a 1 year 1 year fluctuation. On the fixed income side, I'll note, Rumline, they obviously traded, they had no trading in the third quarter, which brought down their year-to-date percentage, into the high 20s. Going back as far as 2017, they've never been lower than 66%. So again, I would consider that an outlier based on that 1 quarter of no trading. The one manager we will be spending some time with following up on, because they have, backslid slightly, is MetLife. They started out several years ago as low as 6%. They rose as high as the mid to high 30s, maybe even the low 40s, and we want to make sure that they continue to have the right programs and processes in place to try and hit that aspirational target more consistently. But by and large, most managers, almost all of them really, are doing as well or better than the target set by the board. And with the one exception I highlighted, we have no significant concerns as a staff.
Any questions on that? Okay, that takes us to the investment performance report.
Sure. So starting just briefly with the end of January, recognizing a lot's happened since then. Plans slightly underperformed for the month at a negative 3.7%. That was about 20 basis points below the benchmark. You should have received updated estimates through the 22nd of February yesterday. That showed a monthly decline in line with the benchmark of around 1.75%. One thing I did want to point out in terms of the returns, and you can kind of see this as you go through the manager return pages, is that this is almost exclusively a function of the overweight to equities. It is not a manager specific problem. Most managers as groups either outperformed or only slightly underperformed, 10 basis points their target benchmarks. I think the only exception to that was infrastructure, and that was due to 1 month underperformance from REEF, and their long-term returns are strong. So that, again, this is, largely, almost exclusively a result of asset allocation with the overweight to equities. I would note that we have a scheduled RRP payment, the bulk of the city's annual payment, almost $589 million, coming in sometime in March. Staff and Marquette will prepare their annual sources and uses memo for the board's review and input and approval. That we would expect that would allow us, in addition to putting aside some money for benefits, that would allow us to address potentially some of these overweights and underweights. Just a couple of other comments before I turn it over to Marquette. One relates to the cash levels. I know there was a lot of discussion of the positive cash flow during the actuarial presentation. That's obviously a big benefit on the investment side. We did have to raise money for benefits once in the last many months. Again, that prevents us from trying to have a to-market time as a staff, and allows us to pay benefits, out of existing cash as opposed to selling things. The cash balance this morning, or as of yesterday late, was over 180 million. In terms of what's going on in the market, and I know folks from Marquette will have some comments on this. Obviously, I think everyone's familiar with what has been going on, and obviously what happened last evening with Russia and Ukraine. That's obviously having an impact on markets this morning. I would couple that with some continued uncertainty over Taiwan. I think we talked about that a little bit last month, and I think it's clear that something may happen there in the near future. Inflation, that may well get worse before it gets better, depending on how the crisis in Ukraine plays out and how it affects energy markets. Supply chain issues continue to be a problem. Some of you may have seen the article, about how hard it is to continue to buy a car at a reasonable price, and that many car owners are even finding that their used car values, after several years, their car is now worth more than when they bought it, which is kind of an amazing phenomenon. There continues to be some continued mismatch between employers' kind of expectations in terms of wages and benefits and what prospective employees are willing to take jobs for. Federal Reserve action remains a wild card. I guess I would call it bettors or traders this morning, now forecast a 91% chance of only a 25 basis point rate hike next month, as opposed to some folks who are talking about 50. Of course, that could still happen, but that's what the market's pricing in. You're obviously seeing not all assets, particularly assets, behaving as advertised. Bitcoin, cryptocurrency, etc., was often touted as an inflation hedge. That is not how it's behaving, and in fact, gold is up significantly. And then lastly, just on the manager issues or the non-manager issues in the asset allocation, I would just point back to some of the actions the board started taking 5 to 6 years ago, almost entirely removing hedge funds and those kind of vehicles from this plan. Hedge funds have recently experienced their worst 12-month return on record relative to the S&P 500. So, even when you see down months like last month, down months like, this month is likely to be, had the board not taken prudent action a few years ago and continued to stay the course, I think it's very likely those returns would be significantly worse. With that, Kwaku, Dave, Nicole, Jesus, may have some comments to add on the market and the portfolio. And of course, we're happy to take questions.
Chris, I think you've handled everything in terms of the key talking points. The one thing I would add here is, the questions we are getting from clients in this environment, which, I may preempt from some of the trustees. Some of our clients are presently asking us about the asset allocation. Is there anything we do differently? And I can say specifically to this portfolio, there is nothing that we would look to do differently, particularly in this environment. We are naturally lower to fixed income. One of the areas that is going to see a good amount of pressure from inflation and from the Fed action. When we think about the US and the non-US allocation, I think we had a really good discussion and overview and analysis of global low vol in an environment where the market was not as volatile as it is today. And global low vol, perhaps the newest addition to the portfolio is showing in this environment. Why having lower beta equity options can be helpful from a diversification standpoint. The real assets component of the portfolio will continue to, in our expectation, have that positive correlation with inflation. The fact that it's not mark to market on a daily basis will also make the real assets portion of any portfolio, particularly real estate, more attractive in this environment. So all being said, when we look at the City of Philadelphia portfolio, no changes being recommended on our end. And ultimately, the asset allocation continues to look to be, it looks to be defensive, provide actual downside protection, but at the same time, it recognizes that a target rate of return between 7.5% and 7.4% does have to be achieved over the long term. So naturally, our exposures and the building blocks will be good diversifiers against inflation. And then some of the volatility we anticipate coming from the market once again, that's really where the private equity, the real assets, the global low vol, those allocations should really come into play for us. So, just a quick thought from this end with respect to the overall asset allocation. There could be questions regarding Russia and Ukraine, and Nicole is also on the line just to take any questions if anyone has any with respect to the most recent news coming out of that part of the world.
Kwaku, I think I asked a variation of this question probably almost every month. What could make you change that recommendation that we not change our asset allocation? Is there something you could see over the next month that would make you think, oh, wow, that's a big change, that's a structural change, and we should really re-examine the asset allocation?
Rob, that's an excellent question. I think the one thing, the one scenario I can think of, because these left tail events, they're great with hindsight, but when they happen, right, they literally are not what anyone is prepared for. But the one thing I think we could definitely take a look at things with would be a stagflationary environment where we have inflation, but then GDP growth continually declines. So an inflationary environment points to inflation going up, the economy growing. Stagflation points to inflation going up, the economy retracting. In that type of environment, there wouldn't even in that type of environment, there wouldn't be a seismic change in the asset allocation recommendation. We would look to move to a higher weighting within the ranges within real estate and infrastructure. So I think those would be the key changes being advocated there. But when all is said and done, no, I mean, I can't really think of many scenarios where we would kind of scrap and restart again, because if we look at the portfolio really is, it does have complex pockets within it, but it's a simple story of blocking and tackling. We have the equity portion of the portfolio. That is going to be the return-seeking portion of the portfolio. Fixed income will be there to provide some liquidity, and then the alternatives in the form of real estate, private equity, and so on. It's there to really buffer against the daily volatility we see in the market, such as what we're facing now. These closed-end exposures would be expected to actually do well in an environment of shock and dislocation, such as the one that we're in. So the other thing may be, speeding up the pacing or looking to get a little bit over target on the private equity front. But when we think about the core building blocks, again, I can't think of any scenario where we would literally start from scratch and rethink our stance or our approach on this. And this goes back to the diligence, the stress testing, the discussions, the debate, the overview, the analysis we've had with the trustees on a very, very frequent basis. So ultimately, this portfolio, even when times are good, we have provided analyses and discussions around what could go wrong. And that has ultimately led to an asset allocation that we consider to be, all weather in nature. Again, when the market goes down, we can't avoid but going down, but we want to be down by less than the market. And we seem to be achieving that presently with the asset allocation. And then ultimately, when the market goes up, we want to be riding up with the market. And, across different macro environments, we continue to think that this is the asset allocation that's, best weathered for whatever the market has got to throw at us. So that's the response there. So nothing in the way of seismic changes. I think tweaks around the periphery. Once again, maybe adding a little bit more to our existing exposure to real estate, infrastructure on the private equity front. But again, no removing or adding brand new building blocks because they're shiny and new, and we expect them to do things that aren't already being done in the portfolio.
Thank you. And Quaker, that was really helpful.
Thank you.
Wait, Kwaku, it's Fran. On a macro level, do you anticipate the current world events having any effect of decelerating or accelerating the rate at which the Fed increases rates?
Fran, that is a excellent question, and the $1 million question. I would say from where I'm sitting, and if I was Chairman Powell, which I'm not, I would view all of this as a really strong signal to perhaps pump the brakes a little bit and use the out that's being given to not be so bullish on raising interest rates as quickly as they need to go up. I say this because we think about the downside of rates going up, but inflation does persist. That could lead to an environment where GDP doesn't grow as much as we'd like it to. And net trading off inflation and net trading off GDP growth, it would be best to keep both growing at a reasonable rate as opposed to kind of looking to completely combat inflation through interest rates in 2022 and then kind of derailing the path that we're on with GDP. So that would be my thought. That's what I would look to do if I were in Chairman Powell's position. However, I think looking outside of the U.S., Fran, I was reading Germany, for example, their CPI number is bigger than ours even. Germany has doubled down on the sanctions in Russia, and that will have the short-term knock-on effect of raising energy prices in the EU as well as globally. So ultimately, I think the Fed we'll have to think about what other countries are doing and perhaps coordinate a little bit more, kind of like what we did in 2020 with some of the other major economies. We coordinated our policy. We were easing while other countries were easing. I think there should be hopefully a return to that to make sure that there aren't seismic events that happen in other major economies like the Germanys of the world that then trigger other unforeseen consequences here. So I'm erring on the side of caution if I were in the Fed, but I think we'll find out more in recent days with respect to what the Fed thinks about all this and ultimately, how bullish it is on still raising rates at a pretty healthy clip.
Thank you.
No problem. And Nicole, anything from your end, Nicole?
No, I think you hit the nail on the head. I mean, what we're still seeing is that traders are still kind of bullish on the tightening bets with, 6 quarter-point hikes for the Fed, 5 for the Bank of England, 1 for Europe, but European Central Bank, that is. But I mean, in the most recent comments, it sounds as if they're continuing to postpone, at the ECB, that is, interest rate hikes. And I assumed we probably won't see anything material, knock on wood, until this crisis is over and probably into 2023.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
That takes us to staff's report.
Sure, just briefly. $91,494 in securities lending income for January, $50.48 million since the inception of the program. Slight uptick in both diverse and local AUM, just under 27% on a combined basis, over 20% when diverse managers are broken out separately, 9.34%, excuse me, for Philadelphia and surrounding areas. And lastly, the upcoming board meetings are slated for March 24th, April 28th, and May 26th. And that would conclude staff's planned remarks on the report.
Thank you. Any questions for staff? Okay, thank you. Any new business for the estimate committee? Any old business? And it has been moved and properly seconded that we adjourn, and we are adjourned to call the full board into session. Is there, I'm sorry, moved and properly seconded that the board ratify the actions taken by the investment committee. So I will call the roll. Brian?
I approve.
Francois?
Approve.
Vanessa?
I approve.
Marcia?
I approve.
Roosevelt?
I approve.
Paul?
I approve.
Kellen?
I approve.
And Carol?
Approve.
Thank you. The motion carries. I have one piece of new business. I want to congratulate Carol on being recognized by City Council and thank her for coming here instead of going to the session where they were recognizing her.
Thank you.
Any other new business? Any old business? Then it has been moved and properly seconded that we adjourn, and we are adjourned. Thank you all very much. Thanks for sticking with it, and thanks for all the work that got us to as positive a report